The blizzard came down sideways, white knives cutting the highway to nothing, and Bishop Crane felt the old fear rise in him again, the kind that made him hesitate when seconds mattered, because the call crackled through the radio wrong, broken, a runaway kid screaming about a girl in a cage behind a burned-out bait shop, and Bishop's first thought wasn't action but doubt, the voice in his head asking if it was a setup, if it was bait, if trusting a stranger would cost another brother's life. The way it had 5 winters ago, when he'd sent men into a trap and buried 2 of them in frozen ground. So he slowed the pack when he should have pushed, and somewhere off the county road a Hell's Angel girl was locked inside a steel dog cage, breath fogging, fingers blue, snow piling up against rusted bars while the temperature fell like a hammer. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Bishop finally twisted the throttle when the kid's voice came back thinner, weaker, saying her name was Lila, and she wasn't supposed to be there, that someone said it was punishment, and that word hit Bishop in the chest harder than the wind, because punishment was how men like him justified sins they didn't want to own. So he waved the pack on with a sharp hand, and the Iron Reapers fanned out. Behind him, headlights ghosting through the storm, engines low and steady, Hawk riding left as enforcer with his jaw clenched and knuckles white, Miller the medic tucked in close, counting breaths in his head, Reyes the strategist already mapping routes that might still be passable, and Old Dutch on the tail watching for blue and red reflections that would mean the sheriff had decided tonight was the night to remind them who held the law, which was Sheriff Claybornne, a man whose power came from paper and badges and courtrooms, the kind of power that didn't get its hands dirty but buried you anyway. And Bishop knew Claybornne would smell blood if a Hell's Angel girl died in Reaper territory, knew he'd use it to squeeze them, to make examples, to dredge up every unresolved charge like a ledger of sins, and still Bishop felt the hesitation cling to him as they found the bait shop half collapsed under snow, lights dead, wind screaming through broken boards, the runaway kid crouched by the door with bolt cutters shaking in his hands. No more than 16, cheeks raw, eyes wild, telling Bishop he'd already broken 1 lock, but there were 2 more, and his fingers wouldn't work anymore. And Bishop took in the scene fast, the way he always did when fear threatened to freeze him. The empty road, the smell of gas, the way the kid flinched at every engine rev like he expected a beating. And Bishop made a choice that cut him open because it meant trusting the kid and risking a trap. And he ordered Hawk to cover, Reyes to kill the lights, Miller to prep for hypothermia, and when Bishop himself dropped to his knees in the snow to work the lock with numb hands, he saw Lila's eyes through the bars, defiant even as tears froze on her lashes, Hell's Angel ink half hidden under frostbite blisters, and she spat at him weakly, telling him to leave her because no one came without a price. And Bishop felt the weight of every promise he'd ever broken settle on his back as he snapped the last lock and the cage door swung open and Miller wrapped her in his own cut without asking. And the kid collapsed into the snow sobbing because he thought he was going to die here too. And somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, not close enough to see, but close enough to hear, Claybornne announcing himself like a god. And Bishop knew this was only the beginning because saving her meant war in 1,000 quiet ways. Paperwork and pressure and rumors and nights when the Reapers would ride in. Silence wondering which promise Bishop would hesitate on next. But as he lifted Lila and felt how light she was, how close to gone, he made himself a vow he wasn't sure he could keep, that whatever came, he wouldn't slow again, not for fear, not for the past, not even for the law, because some cages were meant to be broken even if the cost came due later. The Iron Reapers holed up in the clubhouse before dawn, the storm still raging outside like it wanted in on the argument. Lila laid out in the back room, wrapped in blankets with Miller hovering over her, checking pulse, warming skin slow so it wouldn't kill her, while the runaway kid, who finally said his name was Evan, sat on the floor against the wall, hugging his knees and watching every door like it might bite him. And Bishop stood at the head of the scarred oak table, feeling the weight of eyes and history, his hesitation already echoing through the room because Hawk slammed a fist down and said flat out that Bishop should have trusted his first instinct and never answered that call, that it smelled like Claybornne all over it. And Reyes fired back calm, but sharp, that if they'd waited 10 more minutes, the girl would have been dead, and then Claybornne would really have them by the throat. And Dutch muttered that the siren wasn't an accident, that the sheriff wanted them to know he was. Watching, always watching, and Bishop listened, jaw tight, guilt coiling in his gut, because every word was true in a different way, and guilt was his flaw, the thing that made him second guess, that made him carry every past loss like it was happening again right now. Miller came out wiping his hands on a rag, eyes tired but steady, and said Lila would live, but the frostbite might cost her 2 fingers, and that she'd asked for Bishop by name even though Bishop had never met her before, which set the room on edge because names meant connections and connections meant leverage. And Bishop went back to the room and sat by her bed while she drifted in and out, her voice low and cracked as she told him she was a Hell's Angel Prospect's sister, taken by men who said they were settling a debt, locked up as a message. And Bishop felt the anger rise, but also the fear, because messages were meant to be read by the right people, and Claybornne was good at intercepting mail. The emotional weight shifted when Hawk pulled Bishop aside near the bar, voice lower now. Not the enforcer, but the brother, telling him he'd followed Bishop into hell before and would again, but that hesitation would get them killed, that Bishop couldn't keep paying for ghosts. And Bishop almost snapped back but stopped himself because Hawk was right, and that hurt more than being wrong. In the corner, Reyes was quietly questioning Evan, not like a cop, just a man asking another man how he ended up breaking locks in a blizzard. And Evan told him he'd been living out of his car since his mom's boyfriend kicked him out, that he'd heard crying when he stopped at the bait shop to get out of the wind, that he didn't know who the girl was until she said Hell's Angel and begged him not to leave. And he admitted he'd lied on the call, said there were men coming back when there weren't, because he was scared no one would come otherwise. And that lie hung in the air heavy because it meant the trigger was built on deception, even if the need was real. Reyes brought that to the table, and silence followed, the kind that meant decisions were forming. And Bishop felt his chest tighten, because protecting Evan now meant protecting a liar who'd almost gotten them killed. And yet the kid had still stayed, still broken locks with numb hands, still saved a life. And Bishop saw himself in that, young and stupid and desperate to do one right thing. The threat escalated fast when Dutch came in from outside with snow on his shoulders and said Claybornne's deputies were parked a mile down the road, not moving, just waiting, and that meant pressure, not a raid yet, just the slow squeeze. And Reyes laid out the chessboard in his head, talking about how Claybornne's power wasn't guns but files, how he'd use Lila as evidence, Evan as a witness, and the Reapers as leverage to push charges or force cooperation. And Hawk wanted to move first, hit the men who'd caged Lila. But Bishop hesitated again because he knew violence would give Claybornne exactly what he wanted, and that hesitation sparked another argument, louder this time, until Miller snapped that Lila needed safety, not speeches, and that someone should ask her what she wanted. And when Bishop did, she surprised them all by saying she didn't want the angels yet, that she was scared of being moved like cargo again, that she trusted the Reapers because they'd come in the storm. And that trust felt like a blade, because Bishop knew how fragile it was. The chapter's emotional center, settled on Reyes as he stepped outside into the storm to think, the strategist carrying his own quiet burden because he'd lost his sister to a system that used people up and called it law. And he stared down the empty highway, imagining Claybornne smile, imagining files stamped and sealed, imagining Evan on a stand being chewed up. And when he came back in, he told Bishop the hard truth that there was no clean move left, that conflict was unavoidable, that the best they could do was choose where it happened and who it hurt least. And Bishop finally nodded, the guilt still there, but sharpened into resolve, ordering Dutch to watch the deputies, Hawk to prep the bikes, Miller to stay with Lila, and Reyes to start digging into who ordered the cage. Because if Claybornne wanted to play with information, then information would cut both ways. And as the storm howled and engines warmed, and Evan watched all of it with wide eyes, realizing the cost of the lock's heat. Broken, the Iron Reapers moved as one, not because they agreed on everything, but because brotherhood meant stepping into the fire together when there was no road left around it. The move came quiet, the way Claybornne liked it. Not sirens or raids, but envelopes and phone calls. And Bishop felt it first when Reyes burst into the clubhouse, holding a stack of papers with his hands, shaking just enough to give him away. Subpoenas for records, notices about zoning violations on the clubhouse, a Child Protective Services inquiry tied to Evan's name, and a sealed order authorizing deputies to take Lila into protective custody for her own safety, which was Claybornne's favorite phrase because it sounded like mercy while it crushed you. And Bishop's guilt flared hot because this was exactly what he'd feared and exactly what he'd delayed acting against. And now the sheriff had momentum. Claybornne himself arrived an hour later, alone but not unprotected, parking his cruiser right out front where everyone could see it, walking in without asking like he owned the place. Hat in hand, smile thin, eyes scanning the room, and lingering on Lila in the back doorway wrapped in a borrowed hoodie. And he spoke soft, almost friendly, saying he admired what the Reapers did for their community, that storms brought out the best in people. But laws still applied, even in bad weather. And he laid it out clean. That Lila was evidence in an ongoing investigation into interstate trafficking. That Evan was a material witness who had admitted to lying on an emergency call, which was a crime, and that Bishop could either cooperate and let the system work or fight and watch everything he loved get buried under procedure. Hawk shifted, muscles bunching, but Bishop raised a hand because this wasn't a fist fight, it was a chokehold, and Claybornne knew it, leaning in close enough that only Bishop could hear him say that hesitation had always been Bishop's tell, that he waited for men to prove they deserved saving, and that waiting cost lives, and Bishop wanted to deny it, but the truth sat there between them like a third man. Lila spoke then, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, telling Claybornne she didn't trust him, that men who talked like him had put her in a cage, and Claybornne smiled sad, and said fear made people say things they didn't mean, that the court would sort it out, and Miller had to physically block Hawk when the enforcer took a step forward, and that restraint felt like betrayal to Hawk, whose loyalty burned hot and simple. And Bishop saw it, saw the crack forming. The sacrifice came from an unexpected place when Evan stood up, legs shaking, and said he'd go, that he'd tell the truth, that he didn't want anyone else hurt because of him, and Bishop felt something tear because protecting the kid was part of the promise now. But Claybornne pounced, nodding, saying that was very responsible, that cooperation would be remembered, and Reyes locked eyes with Bishop and gave a tiny shake of his head because this was how Claybornne divided people, one good choice at a time. Bishop made his shocking decision then, not with violence, but with words, telling Claybornne he'd release Lila to protective custody under one condition, that Miller accompany her as an advocate, that Evan would have a lawyer present at every step, and that any further pressure on the Reapers would be met with public exposure of certain procedural irregularities Reyes had uncovered. And Claybornne laughed softly, impressed despite himself, saying Bishop was learning, but that learning lay still, had costs, and he agreed because he wanted this to stretch out, wanted Bishop to feel every inch of it. As deputies took Lila away, she reached for Bishop's hand and said, "Thank you for breaking the cage," even if it wasn't the last one, and that broke something open in him because he knew cages came in many forms. The betrayal hit after, when Hawk confronted Bishop alone in the garage, accusing him of handing them over, of choosing paper over blood, and Bishop tried to explain the long game, but Hawk heard only excuses, and he threw down his cut and said maybe Bishop's guilt had finally made him weak, that maybe the Reapers needed a leader who didn't freeze when it mattered. And that was the deepest cut, because it was born of love, not hate. The chapter closed with Claybornne watching from his cruiser as Hawk rode off into the storm. One brother fractured, one girl in custody, one kid walking into a system that chewed people up, and Bishop standing in the doorway, feeling the collision of every choice he'd made, knowing the next move wouldn't be quiet, and that whatever justice came would demand a price he wasn't sure he could pay. The showdown didn't come with gunfire, but with fluorescent lights and a ticking clock. Bishop riding alone through the last of the storm to the county courthouse because Reyes had found the seam in Claybornne's armor, a chain of custody error tied to the men who'd ordered the cage, a private contractor on a sheriff's parole who'd skimmed funds and traffic favors, and it meant stepping into the lion's mouth and trusting the law to bite one of its own. And Bishop felt the guilt press down, hard because this path asked him to wait again, to trust a process that had failed people he loved. But he walked in anyway with Miller at his shoulder and Lila waiting pale but upright, fingers bandaged, eyes sharp, while Evan sat with the public defender trying to look older than he was, and Claybornne stood across the room calm as stone, power radiating from his badge and the quiet confidence of a man who'd won most of his wars without lifting a hand. The words did the damage first. Reyes' evidence laid out clean and cold, dates and signatures and favors traded, the judge's brow tightening as the story unfolded, Claybornne's smile thinning when it became clear the net wasn't meant for the Reapers today. And when the order came down to detain the contractor and suspend the transfer of Lila pending review, it felt like air rushing back into a room that had been sealed too long. But justice cut both ways because Claybornne leaned in close to Bishop as they passed and said this wasn't over, that careers didn't die from one hearing, that he still held files and friends in time, and Bishop nodded because he believed him. The physical cost came fast after, not in the courtroom but outside, when Hawk reappeared out of the gray on his bike, riding too hard, tires slipping, because loyalty had dragged him back even after pride pushed him away, and a deputy's car clipped his rear as it peeled out reckless, sending Hawk down hard on the wet pavement. The sound of bone on asphalt a crack that silenced everyone. And Bishop was on his knees in the rain holding Hawk's head while Miller worked, blood mixing with sleet. Hawk gasping that he'd been wrong, that fear made men say stupid things, that Bishop had broken the right cage. And those words cost Hawk a collarbone and a long hospital stay, but they gave Bishop something he hadn't felt in years, forgiveness that didn't come with conditions. Claybornne watched the ambulance doors close with a face that showed nothing. But the public had seen enough, whispers already moving faster than badges. And when the news hit that night rides had turned into candlelight outside the hospital, bikers from 3 counties showing up not to fight, but to stand, 813 of them by count, cuts off, heads bowed, honoring a runaway kid who'd done the bravest thing any of them had seen by breaking locks in a blizzard, honoring a girl who'd survived because strangers chose her over safety, and honoring a brother who'd paid for loyalty in blood. Consequences still hurt. The clubhouse would be audited, rides would be watched, Evan would carry the weight of testimony for years. Lila would lose 2 fingers and a piece of her trust forever, and Bishop would live with the knowledge that waiting had almost killed them all. But as dawn broke and the storm finally let go, Bishop stood on the courthouse steps with Reyes and Miller and Dutch and felt something settle that wasn't victory, but resolve. A quieter thing, earned the hard way because redemption didn't erase scars. It taught you how to live with them. Claybornne drove past once more, slower this time, a promise and a warning in equal measure, and Bishop didn't flinch because hesitation had cost enough, and when he swung a leg over his bike and the reapers fell in behind him, engines humming low on wet asphalt. The road ahead wasn't clean or safe, but it was theirs to ride, and that was enough for now.